So tonight, it is with great pride that Gramercy Books brings you two of the most talented and original writers and thinkers in this country. We welcome award-winning author Ross Gay as he launches his first work of prose, The Book of Delights, a collection of short, lyric essays written over the course of a year that celebrates both the simple and profound joys of daily living. Though grounded in positivity, Ross never brushes over life's complexities. His musings identify delight despite the challenges of the world today. The Book of Delights, published by Algonquin Books, is a one-of-a-kind evocation of a voice that is funny, poetic, philosophical, and inclusive, and where much of the delight is found in the very language with which delight is explored. Ross Gay is the author of 3 books of poetry, including Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. That collection won the 2015 National Book Critics Circle Award and the 2016 Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award, along with being a finalist for the National Book Award in Poetry, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the Ohioana Book Award. Ross has received fellowships from the Cavan Canham Foundation, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and the Guggenheim Foundation, and he teaches at Indiana University in Bloomington. Ross will be in conversation with one of the most notable poets and cultural critics in the country, Hanif Abdurraqib, whose most recent book, his third, Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest, is itself inventive and original, personal, and voice-driven. It was published just last month by University of Texas Press. It is Hanif's distinct lens that brings such poignancy and magnetism to everything he writes. Hanif was Gramercy Books' very first featured poetry night artist, reading from his first book of poems, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, and we were thrilled to help launch his debut collection of essays, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us. Hanif is a Callaloo Creative Writing Fellow and worked for the MTV News, where he wrote about the intersections of music, culture, and identity. His work has been published in the New York Times, the New Yorker, ESPN Magazine, The Fader, Pitchfork, and The Nation. Copies of the Book of Delights and Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude are both available at Gramercy Books, as is Go Ahead in the Rain. Ross and Hanif will autograph copies of their books after our program at our signing table. Now, Ross is going to come up first. He's going to read, and then Hanif and Ross will be in conversation. We will be taking photographs as well, so I apologize in advance for being in your way at times. So thank you so much. Ross.
How's it going? There's a big dog right up there. It's good.
It's actually a polar bear. So.
Really? It's a polar bear. Thanks for coming out. It's good to see you all.
It's good to see
you
too.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very nice of you. I'm glad to be here with Hanif, and I sort of was thinking about some of the. I'm reading his beautiful book right now, and I'm thinking about this reading a little bit. I want to read a few things that are in sort of conversation with some of the music that you're talking about, and which are also the ideas and the moments that you're talking about. So I'll kind of do a little bit of that throughout. I'm going to read for 20 minutes. This first one is called Weirdly Untitled. Yesterday I read poems at the Abraham Heschel School on 60th Street to a group of 70 or so fairly attentive 11th graders. Some were very attentive, budding poets that they were, hanging around to chat with me after the reading. One kid was even so bold as to stick around after the rest of his crew had dispersed to quietly ask, "Do you ever write stoned?" Though I don't, I in no way discouraged the child from indulging, which I worried about for a few seconds as I was leaving the school, walking down 60th toward Columbus Circle in a windstorm, hoping I didn't condemn that child to a life of sorrow. My favorite of the stragglers, go figure, was the light-skinned, fluffy Afro child with an Africa medallion, straight out of a Multiculti Tribe Called Quest video. Better yet, straight out of a Jungle Brothers or a De La Soul video. That's it. He was so De La. He also had a Black Panthers pin above his heart on his sweatshirt. He could have been me in 1989, with my Ethiopia pin affixed to my collar, which, in Levittown, Pennsylvania, was as much a fly in the buttermilk move as this child's here at Heschel School. But not so much, given as Heschel marched with King, given as we were in Manhattan, given the long, if complicated, political companionship between blacks and Jews, and Levittown was built as an exclusionary community, a segregated community about 20 miles north of Philadelphia, conceived of almost in anticipation of Brown v. Board of Education, the inauguration of an era of great racist innovation, turns out. My brother's first house in Lemoyne, Pennsylvania, had a clause in the title that prohibited it from being sold to a colored person, which he is. Indulge the anachronism, it was in the title. And he seemed to enjoy at least to touch the soiling, the filthing, his body in that space was. The filthing, the squadron of filth he calls his family is. Actually, he barely mentioned it. I enjoyed the filthing. I trust you understand with my word choice, I am deploying a kind of harsh irony, which works, if it works, because you discern a proximity to a true sentiment, a familiarity with a true sentiment, the sentiment my white mother's grandmother, my family, expressed by wiping her hand on her apron after shaking reluctantly my father's hand, which is by now a cliche based on truth. A truth that occurred, among other places, in Verndale, Minnesota in 1971. As my mother gets older, and in moments of openness, she has begun sharing more of her early life with my father. The family stuff, the this apartment is no longer available stuff, the you have doomed your children, they will be fucked in the head stuff. It is no special doom they have inflicted upon us, turns out. Neither is our head fuck especially special. The other night I was driving my mother home from the movie Loving about the story behind the Supreme Court case that banned the ban on interracial marriage, which my mom kind of loved and I kind of didn't. That came out wrong. I love the ban. Or I love the ban of the ban. The Supreme Court ruling, I love it. I just thought the movie was a two-dimensional reinscription of hetero boringness. She told me my dad, to whom she was married for about 35 years until he died, said to her early on, I might be making too much trouble in your life. Maybe we shouldn't do this. But, you know, they did. Thank you. This is such a nice bookstore.
It is.
I'm so glad to be reading here. This is called The High-Five from Strangers, Etc. So the premise of this book is that every day for one day I was like, oh, had some delightful experience. I don't know what it was. And it had to do with bees, flowers, you know. And I thought, oh, I should write an essay about that. And then I said, oh, you know, it'd be really interesting to write an essay about something that delighted me every day for a year. So I endeavored to do that and got close, you know. So anyway, so they have, you know, there's 102 essays in this book. This one's called The High-Five from Strangers, Etc. Today I was wandering the square of the small Indiana town where I gave a poetry reading at the local college. There's these long parentheticals in this book too. A feature of the small town Midwest, you can relate to this. A feature of the small town Midwest, a city hallish building in the center, always with some sad statue trumpeting one war or another. This one had a guy in one of those not very protective looking hats they called a helmet during World War I. He's carrying, naturally, a gun. Jenna Osman's book, Public Figures, alerted me to the ubiquity of the gun, the weapon, in the hands of our statues. A delight I wish to now imagine and even impose, given that beneficent dictatorship, of one's own life anyway, is a delight. All new statues must have in their hands flowers, or shovels, or babies, or seedlings, or chinchillas. We could go on like this for a while. But never again, never ever, guns. I decree it, and I also decree the removal of the already extant guns. Let the emptiness our war heroes carry be the metaphor for a while. As I was finishing circling the square, I passed a storefront garage with huge Make America Great Again signs. It was a foreign auto repair shop, and inside were mostly Toyotas and Hondas. I settled into the coffee shop where it seemed every other black person in this town was also hiding, every one of us offering each other some discreet version of the greeting. Took my notebooks out, and I was reading over these delights, transcribing them into my computer. And while I was working, headphones on, swaying to the new De La Soul record, Delight, which deserves its own entry, I noticed a white girl. She looked 15, but could have been, I suppose, a college student, standing next to me with her hand raised. I looked up, confused, and pulled my headphones back. And she said, like a coach or something, "Working on your paper? Good job to you. High five." And you better believe I high-fived that child. In her pre-ripped Def Leppard shirt and her itty-bitty Doc Martens. For I delight in unequivocally pleasant public physical interactions with strangers. What constitutes pleasant, it's no secret, is informed by my largish, male, and cisgender body. A body that is also largish, male, cisgender, and not white. In other words, the pleasant, the delightful are not universal. We should all understand this by now. A few months ago, walking down the street in Umbertide in Italy, a trash truck pulled up beside me and the guy in the passenger seat yelled something I didn't understand. I said, "Como?" The Spanish word for come again, which is a ridiculous thing to say because even if he had come again, I would not have understood him. He knew this, and hopping out of the truck to dump in a couple cans, he flexed his muscles, pointed at me, and smacked my biceps hard. Twice. I loved him. Or when a waitress puts her hand on my shoulder, forget it if she calls me honey. Baby, even better. Or if someone scooting by puts their hand on my back. The handshake, the hug, I love them both. Once I was getting on a plane and shuffling down the aisle, I saw, sitting at the front of coach, reading a magazine, my great Uncle Earl. I got down on my knees and put my hand on his forearm and said, "Uncle Earl, it's me, Ross." He looked at me kind of quizzically, as did the woman traveling with him, who did not look one bit like my Aunt Sylvia. Which made me look back at my not Uncle Earl, who looked maybe like my Uncle Earl's second cousin 20 years ago. And though it was benign and no one was hurt, it was a little weird. And they looked confused. All the same, given his Uncle Earl died about 6 months later, I'm delighted I got to see him and touch him gently, lovingly, about 1,000 miles away. Thank you. This one's called The Marfa Lights. My buddy Pat and I went to shoot around at the courts here in Marfa today. We were warming up, shooting 12-footers or doing slow spin moves and crossovers, when a young guy from the other side of the court swaggered toward us, holding a ball on his hip, the light gleaming in his earrings, and challenged us to a 2-on-2, pointing his thumb to himself and back to his buddy draining threes from the corner. We agreed and went on to kick the shit out of them, 21-0. That's a horrible figure of speech. And I leave it in only to expose the violence we so easily say. We got more baskets than they did. That they were only 12 years old is irrelevant. Given as this was their home court. And they even had a crowd watching. Another little girl who, when one of the kids shouted to the gods, "They're kicking our butts," said, "I hope so." They're grown men. I'm going to read you just 3 more real quick. This is called To Spread the Sweetness of Love. How many of you know Stevie Wonder's record, The Secret Life of Plants?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's incredible if you don't know it. It sort of evaded me for a lot of years, weirdly. Because I'm deep in this certain little time of his music. To spread the sweetness of love. It's not a bad earworm to have. Stevie Wonder's Come Back as a Flower from his somewhat overlooked album, The Secret Life of Plants, 1979. an experimental eco-treatise, tinkling Casio sound effects, birdsong, brooks babbling, all manner of delightful sonic theatrics. This album comes after the string of records in the early 70s that I will go on record as saying is among the finest stretches of artistic production in history. Even though anytime someone says something stupidly categorical like that, I always think, what an asshole, and stop listening. Music of My Mind, 1972. Talking Book, 1972. Fulfillingness First Finale, 1973. Inner Visions, 1974. And Songs in the Key of Life, 1976. You know songs from these records even if you don't know you know songs from these records. And especially not a bad earworm to have these days. Today, walking through the Denver airport on a layover to Santa Fe, feeling a bit anxious at all the camo and hunting gear, which I know, might have a different valence here than where I'm from in southern Indiana. Hunters being sometimes among the truest stewards of the land, I know. My anxiety likely has something to do with the impending inauguration. Most likely. Exxon's Rex Tillerson's hearing was today. Scott Pruitt's in the mix. Secret Life of Plants. Flower power. As antidote to my anxiety, I was doing laps through the airport, going up and down the stairs, circling the terminal, making friendly eye contact, observing my mind as my legs burned some steam, watching it fixate and defixate, all the while listening to Stevie Wonder's Come Back as a Flower on repeat. As I was climbing some steps, I noticed 4 women, uniformed, maybe kiosk workers on their break, chatting and relaxing. They looked to me like they were probably East African, and one of them, maybe in her 30s, was gently arranging an older, maybe 50s or 60s, hard to say, you know what we say, woman's collar beneath her sweater, freeing it from the cardigan's neck, using both of her hands to jostle it free, but also seeming to spend a little more time than necessary, creasing the fold of the collar, the other hand kind of resting on her shoulder, the two of them chatting the whole time, sitting there holding each other, nodding, my head twisting toward them like a sunflower as I finished the stairs and walked by. So in love was I with this common flourish of love, this everyday human light. This is called ambiguous signage sometimes. I do not want to be the kind of person who feels superior or is irritated or, God forbid, sneers at a sign that has a typo or a grammatical error, especially if that sign is not in an English department. I have a feeling you know what I mean. I come from a family of educators, many of them black educators, from whom my father, not a black educator officially, but unofficially, inherited the reflex of correcting, often ironically, this child's speech. Me: Dad, can I have a quarter? Dad: I don't know, can you? Me:
Oh my God.
I don't understand. The lesson, as you know, is may I. A lesson I never, ever demonstrate having learned unless I'm speaking with a British accent. But what I have learned is the worry one might have about one's child, perhaps most especially one's black or brown child, speaking improper English, wearing improper colors, having improper etiquette, or displaying improper tastes, which, in the case of my dad and me, really meant behaving in the style or manner of black people, the idea of black people, which really meant one's black or brown child being perceived as the idea of black people. This prospect of which, for my father, though I never heard him say it plainly, must have been a terror. Let me pause here to recommend Margot Jefferson's brilliant book, Negroland, which explains my father ejecting my NWA 100 Miles and Running tape from the boombox and dropping it in the trash. A performative gesture, really, meaning something between you aren't running from anything and you're going to be running from my foot up your ass. But one that has imprinted on me as I was keeping it real by digging through my spoogy tissues to retrieve Eazy-E and friends. You will run less if you know how to say may I, he actually meant, and don't even think about ain't. It is not too much to say, and the older I get, the more I understand it's really not too much to say, that he was trying to keep us alive physically and psychically by inuring us to the many registers of hatred, overt and subtle, leveled at black people. He was trying to make our blackness, or the idea of our blackness, invisible, which he must have known was not quite possible. My father could be viciously protective, like the time he nearly murdered the posse of teenage skinheads in our apartment complex who pinned me to the ground and held a cigarette up to my face. Or was about to stomp into oblivion the dog that charged me when we were delivering the piggyback shopper. But my favorite, I think, was when he was with me in Humeville Municipal Court, where I was to defend myself against trespassing charges, a citation or something, for I had been sledding in the wrong place and was handcuffed and put into the back of the squad car. And when I lied to the judge, I love that sentence, that phrase. And when I lied to the judge, telling him I never saw any trespassing signs along the route to Fireman's Hill, the cop asked, "Can you read?" My father answered for me, "Yes, he can read," in a tone that meant, "Motherfucker." This essay might as well be called a tangent, for I mostly thought I would talk about, but will instead end on, this delightful sign in the room where I'm staying, just to the side of the mantel, which somehow feels relevant to the conversation. It reads, like a haiku, "Fireplace, out of order, thank you." And this is the last one I'll read. It's called Cocoa Baby. I caught sight of myself this morning in the mirror applying coconut oil to my body. I was bent over with one foot on the edge of the tub, rubbing the oil into my calves, which have become a particularly ashen part of my body, particularly visibly ashen as it's summer, which I'm trying to address with a loofah and the oil abundantly applied. If you want to get way further into this, and I think you do, I recommend Simone White's essay Lotion in her book Of Being Dispersed. This time of year, I am mostly brown, except for the stretch from my waist to my mid-thighs, which is a lighter shade, neither of them to be compared to a food or coffee drink. With my leg up like this, bent over, my testicles swaying just beneath my pale thigh, I wondered if, whenever I am in this position, which is often, oiling, cutting toenails, I will always think of Toy Derricott's poem In the Undertaker's Daughter, where as a child she walks in on her abusive father standing more or less just like this, though he's shaving. Seeing his testicles dangling like that, she thinks they're his udders, as she writes, "The female part he hid, something soft and unprotected I shouldn't see." I watched myself rub the oil liberally on my body while I was still wet, which my dear friend recently taught me keep some of the moisture in. I got my calves, then my feet, lacing my fingers into my toes. When doing this, I often recall another friend who, watching me put lotion on my feet one day, smiled and said, "Good job." Up to my thighs, inner and outer, around to my ass, which seems to want to break out some when I'm sitting too much. Then I get both arms and shoulders, my chest and stomach, and what I can reach of my back. Usually I oil my face with the residual oil on my hands, and finish by oiling my penis. Not always last, but often, which I wouldn't read too much into, one way or the other. Today when I watched myself, particularly when I was oiling my chest and stomach, which I do kind of by self-hugging, I was thinking how many bodies of mine are in this body, this nearly 43-year-old body stationed on this plane for the briefest. I could see, as I always can, probably kind of dysmorphically, my biggest body, when it was 260 pounds and a battering ram and felt sort of impervious. I could also see my 12-year-old self, chubby and gangly and ashamed. And of course the baby me, who I don't remember being, though I have seen pictures. When you watch yourself in the mirror oiling yourself like this, wrapping your arms around yourself, jostling yourself a little, it is easy, or easier, to see yourself as a child, and maybe even a child you really love. It is easy, if you decide it, which might be hard, to let the oiling be of the baby you. Or at least I thought so today, looking at myself, whom I am so often not nice to. But the baby you oil until he shines.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about the word delight. And I've spent time with the book for a while. And from a linguistic standpoint, was thrilled at how much the actual word delight showed up in the text.
Well, good, because I was like, I hope it didn't get too boring. That was my worry. Like, God, how many times can I say this word?
Well, I was going to ask if it was intentional or if it was
Yeah.
the thing where, you finish a manuscript and then you like you run it through and see what word comes up the most and you're like, oh shit.
It's that word. Yeah, it's definitely. I was aware of it, but not wanting to not wanting to kill the word.
Yeah.
So there's like a bound. Like how many times can you say the word delight and delighted and delightful without like completely flattening what the word means?
Yeah. Why? We were talking before this about how we're both kind of traveling a lot now.
Yeah.
In the delights of home that we have left behind in
Yeah.
pursuit of this, which is also a delight, of course.
Yeah.
But in your kind of quiet moments, or in the moments that are kind of separate from the performance of the work, do you feel delight echoing through you then, or is this kind of? I guess I'm asking if you have you lived out your greatest delights through the writing of this book, or do they kind of echo in the quiet moments as well?
Yeah. No, I feel like the nice thing about this, the nice thing about writing this book is that it has sort of, cultivated to some extent like this muscle that I think I've been cultivating for some time, but like, a kind of attentiveness that these essays are basically, among the things that they do is like they sort of, they're moments of study. They're like they're time. They're like little parts of a day where I'm studying something or thinking hard about something, and I do feel like I've sort of cultivated that as a muscle. So, so it's not over. Yeah.
Speaking of cultivation, a thing that so when I first read this, my initial thought was, well, I love this book because I have followed your work for so long, so I instinctively care about you, right? Because of what you offer in your work. And I wondered, well, what is a stranger going to think? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think so much of the work of the book is an accumulation that kind of cultivates a relationship with the reader, where the reader all of a sudden cares about this year or cares about your movements through the year. Yeah. Was that an intentional practice, or is that something? I mean, I know that in your poems, that's something we're kind of used to.
Right.
We're kind of used to the sprawling thing that we're holding on for to turn. I've heard you read the thing about Martha like 3 times now, and it's still kind of joyous to find that nugget at the end with the kids, right? Yeah. But how do you cultivate that on the edge of your seat kind of feeling for an entire body of work among strangers? Cast off into the world.
Yeah. Good question. I do feel like in the catalog book, I started thinking in a new sort of way about like really what does it mean to be speaking to an audience, and I guess part of that is like how does it also mean to be telling a story or like doing this thing of like trying to listen closely both to who you're talking to, and as a way to sort of encourage someone to listen closely. Yeah, but it's I'm glad. Thank you for saying that it feels like that. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, man. I think a weird thing about nonfiction is that a lot of times it requires some personal stake. Some immediate payoff for a reader.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of want to talk about just the act of this book, how it came to life, because I've been thinking a lot too about how the way that writers talk about writing and how kind of fucked up it is, where how writers talk about writing to aspiring writers and people who are not writers, right? Where people talk about the rigors of writing or writing X amount of times for X amount of days or all of these things that build a writing discipline that doesn't really is not universal, but it's talked about as though it's universal, right? Like when I was at Cal, one of the first things I was told was like, you have to write every day. And I was like, well, if I don't feel like writing every day, you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
The fuck if I don't feel like writing? You know what I mean? It was that was the only option. And so I loved hearing you talk about this thing, this project as not discipline, but practice.
Yeah.
Right? You were practicing you were practicing something. And I imagine there have been more competitive poets who will say something to me as not as poets but as people, more competitive people who are poets who will give the analogy of the basketball player shooting free throws when no one's around, right? Which I suppose is an analogy that works, as we are both people who have shot basketballs when no one's around.
Totally.
But
the thing with like basketball, and maybe to some extent this isn't totally true, but with basketball, you know, when you're writing poems, like if you're walking through the day like with your eyes open, or walking through the day like leaning into like what people are saying, or walking through the day like touching things, you know, you're in your practice. And I mean, you know, we can make an argument. I mean, you can make an argument probably that like there's a way that you could be practicing your foul shots while not shooting your foul shots, but it helps a lot to have a hoop, you know? It helps a lot to have a hoop, you know?
Yeah, I think I think that is, you got to what I was getting at, right? How does the writer practice while not in front of the page, and is the practice the thing that makes the return to the page easier? But with this particular project, what drove you to the initial stages of that idea? And I love, you know, when I think people talk about Ross Gay poems, there's like sprawl and kind of the long breathless sentences that kind of stretch from page to page to page. And so for me as a reader of your work, I was surprised at how complex and compact these were. And so I'm wondering if the practice too was a bit of restraint.
Oh yeah. But first I want to say your book is an example of the kind of practice that you're doing all the time. Like, I don't know how long it took you to write this book, but you've been writing this book for a long time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It, and so that's another example of like how, you know, we're at work on these things we're practicing, you know, like, so like, because you're not like we're not writing sentences or we're not writing lines doesn't mean that we're not, like, the work is happening, you know. And sometimes it's like not working that's the work, like not doing the work. Anyway, I just want to say that.
This is funny because I feel like if there's anyone in here who's ever taken like a writing workshop with me, they've heard me say that exact thing.
Really?
So,
that's good.
Thanks for reaffirming.
That's good.
Because I feel like they're like, that sounds like not work.
Yeah.
Like when I say it, they're like, that sounds fake.
Yeah. I mean, that's that sort of like that mythology that you know, that making shit is always the best thing to do.
Production is the
and it's not. You know, it's not. Sometimes we need not to make shit. But the difference between these essays, and I still can't quite articulate the difference between poems and essays, but except to say that there's some relationship to knowledge that is different between the two. But because these essays were like drafted daily, there's a kind of dailiness, there's a sort of time limit that I gave myself to draft the things. Like I knew that there was something limited in scope, that they wouldn't be like with a poem like moving around in time in a certain way, or the syntax would have to have some kind of something that would be different than a poem. So it did feel significantly different, but I can't yet exactly articulate, you know, but I do feel like I can't write poems every day. And I couldn't write a poem a day. If I wrote a poem a day, even as a practice, it would feel like just like an odd thing, you know?
Why?
I mean, partly because like, and I know I already, I always talk about this Dr. J poem. But, but I've been working on it for like 4 or 5 years, and it's just like, that's what I think of as writing a poem for me. Like, it's like, I don't know, you know, it's so much about, I really don't know how to do it. You know, I really don't know how to do it. So, and that's what I enjoy about doing it. Like when I know how to write a poem, I'm like less interested in doing it. You know?
Yeah. What's difficult and not particularly fun is, sorry if anyone here has ever interviewed me and asked this question, but what's not particularly fun is being asked the like, how do you write between genres question, I think, because what's more interesting to me, or what's rattling underneath that, is how does your approach to looking change, or how does your approach to living in the world change? Or like beyond the production again, like how are you seeing beyond what you would naturally see and returning to the work differently? Is there something different happening for you
between the two genres?
Yeah.
Is there for you?
No.
No.
But I mean, I'm sure there is. I can't define it though. You know what I mean? Like, I
Yeah.
think that if I'm trying to, I think that I am perhaps more inclined to yell at the thing sitting in my palm when I'm writing an essay. Right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, I want you to see this. Where in a poem, I'm more than willing to just like walk into the town square and hold out my palm and wait
Yeah.
to see who comes. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
yeah.
So I think there's more like the essay can be a bit more urgent
Right.
in the immediacy of it.
Yeah. When I think of it, that's an interesting way, and it's kind of adjacent to this feeling of like there's a different relationship to knowledge that I can't quite articulate, but there is a different relationship to knowledge. And the essay feels like it has maybe a different kind of knowledge itself. Maybe. But yeah, I don't know. It's so interesting. And then like right when I say that, I'm working on this longer book about my relationship to the land, and it's ostensibly a book of nonfiction, but it feels to me so much like a poem.
Right.
Like and it feels, the way that I don't understand it feels like a poem, you know?
I sometimes wonder if the dividing point is the amount of information being delivered in the way it's delivered.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's true. Like, I feel like in your poems particularly, you're delivering a high volume of information, but in a different way than I felt like it was delivered in the book of the Lights.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm wondering how facts transfer. But more than that, you know, you said this thing in an interview once a while ago about how a poem, you go back to a poem and you know it's working, and you know when you can no longer kind of like see through it and see all the ways that it can be better or more full.
Yeah.
How do you know the essay is working, or how did you find yourself knowing these essays are working, especially because you were drafting them at such a high rate?
Yeah. Well, I have really dear friends who read for me. You know, Patrick Rosal, Adeseli Kirmai, Simone White read a couple of these things. So I have some friends who tell me, you know, and I rely on my friends to do my work, like deeply reliant. And sometimes I think a thing's working and it's totally not, you know. And sometimes I think a thing is not working, and people show me how, maybe it is working a little bit. So that's one thing. I rely on friends and readers. I feel like I also there is some kind of like transformation or revelation or, you know, change in my relationship to the subject, to the whatever the ostensible subject of the inquiry is, that is like a beginning toward a completed thing, you know. So if the thing if my relationship to the thinking is actually changed, if I'm transformed in the process of thinking through this thing, that's the beginning of like, okay, so at least that first part's done.
Right.
In terms of making it a thing that I want to share, that's the next thing, you know.
Do you get tired of you know, I feel like people and this is not a wrong reading of your work or whatever, but I think so many people ruminate on this idea of expanding upon mundanities without approaching the fact that for you, the reader / speaker of the poem, these things were never mundane in the first place, right? And I guess there's no good question. I'm going to be somewhat hypocritical and ask you about your relationship to what many would call mundane and how effortlessly you seem to expand on that.
I do feel like it is practice, though. I do feel like it's if anything, this book has been a lot of time like doing that, like looking in seams and stuff and being like, oh, that thing I didn't think about before is in fact fascinating, you know, and beautiful and wonderful and strange. And, you know, like I started noticing taking like cataloging these things that like these sort of bodily interactions that people do, like, you know, when you're reading or you're talking and someone sort of mouths with you. It's so beautiful to me. Or when people write and they mouth. Or when people can't quite read what they've written, they've written something but they can't quite make out the words and the faces that we make doing that. Or like the way that when someone else is reading and you're going to read next, the way that we negotiate the time and space of that, you know, all of us differently, but like all those little things, I don't know. I don't know. I forgot the question.
But I think even that is it, right? To get so caught up in the, I think, I find, I think I find myself most invested and excited about this when immersed in like the nuances of music history, right? Where I'll be, waxing on and on about the making of some song, and before I know it, my partner is like falling asleep, and I'm still waving my arms about this thing. So I think there's something really permission giving about the ruminations on the otherwise small. I mean, it's a kind of exuberance. Like when I'm reading in your book, like sort of the cataloging of all of the different influences or the different samples. I'm sort of thinking about the samples. That's a kind of exuberance, just to sort of like, this kind of, I mean, part of being like an interesting critic, I think, an interesting ruminator on the things that we love is exuberance. Is like, absolutely. I'm going to tell you about this stuff so deep. Like you'll never have heard this before. And I might go a little further even than you're interested in, but check it out. Check it out. And exuberance for its own is like, is wonderful. Like to be around. I think when I'm around people, I have an essay in here called "Touched," and I'm sort of talking about this term, this word that where my mother's from, Minnesota, you say "touched," and it means something sort of like they're different. And it's I sort of meditate on the way that I'm going to read it. Can I read it? Mm-hmm.
It's okay.
Absolutely.
But this is like, there is a touch. There is a designation. It might be old-timey. It might be regional. It might have its origins in any number of religious stories, prophety stories, in which the laying on of hands offers not only cure but vision, difference, which difference, among those afraid of it, can make the designation, touched, as much slur as compliment, meaning something like not right in the head, or off one's rocker. A usage that this sentence is teaching me is in fact no slur at all, but rather a self-designation as nervous about the difference in oneself. Probably this is the case with all slurs. Today I saw a man riding a janky bike down the sidewalk on Cass Street in Detroit. His bike had a normal-sized rear tire coupled with a small, even petite front tire, perhaps rigged from a lawnmower? A banana seat of the Huffy circa 1982 variety, sparkling streamers, sparkly handle grips, some bells, and several other accoutrements. My favorite being the black propeller whirling about 3 feet above the cyclist's head atop a pole affixed to the handle at the rear of the banana seat. If it was my bike, I might have opted for a pink or purple propeller, but all the same, any propeller on an adult bike constitutes keeping it 100. This man, who I would guess was in his 50s or 60s and wore a beanie and wraparound sunglasses and sat on his vehicle upright as a monarch, and who smiled broadly and nodded his head to me, acknowledging me, was what one might call touched. As was the young man I saw zoom by my office a couple days ago on those shoes with the wheels built in, which I covet. And with it, if anyone finds a size 14, or with the sparkles, like the lights, God, I love this. I saw zoom by my office a couple days ago on those shoes with the wheels built in, which I covet, and with a fur ball dangling from a length of elastic that was meant, I extrapolated, to represent the idea of a bunny's tail. He was a roller skating bunny. As was the kid in line a couple weeks back who, when Billie Jean came on the radio, started dancing unabashedly, imitating MJ, Michael Jackson, in the video, to the extent that he could, which was ambitious and sweet. All of these examples make clear that touched often also means exuberant or enthusiastic, both of which qualities can provoke in us, when we are feeling small and hurtable, something like embarrassment, which again maybe points to the terror at our own lurking touchedness. When I watched the child doing his wonky, unself-conscious moonwalk, I had a feeling that I might have then identified as embarrassment, aware of this kid's obliviousness, his immersion, his delight. But I am coming to identify that feeling of embarrassment as something akin to tenderness, because in witnessing someone's being touched, we are also witnessing someone's being moved, the absence of which is in ourselves is a sorrow and a sacrifice. And witnessing the absence of movement in ourselves by witnessing its abundance in another, moonwalking toward the half and half, or ringing his bell on Cass Street, can hurt, until it becomes, if we are lucky, an opening.
Because you read the piece that briefly placed the scene right before the inauguration. A thing that I found fascinating when working on the Tribe book, or at least the dialogue around the last Tribe album, right, was that there was a lot of America that seemed to feel as though, like, post-election, the responsibility of the black artist was to shed some light on the what do we do next question, as if that hasn't been like a foundation of American black art, right? The ever shifting we and the ever shifting next. And what I've most loved about this book is that the political urgency is entirely wrapped up in the self and survival, like the self-survival and moving through a year that is sometimes treacherous and sometimes not, and the balancing of those two things. There's a kind of normalcy to it all, right? That doesn't at all feel frantic or panicked or necessarily concerned with granting answers to a nation, right? And I'm mostly interested in what you feel your responsibilities as an artist are, if any. Was that a bad question?
No, it's a great question. And it makes me think. I want to say about this one book called The Sovereignty of Quiet by Kevin Quashie, where it's such a beautiful book, and what he's doing is sort of talking about that there's this idea that, you know, black artistic expression is supposed to always be grounded in as a kind of resistance. Like resistance is the the only mode of expression that's worthwhile, and that's, you know, obviously that's a racist idea,
right?
You know, as though the ground of our existence is not more complicated than just being like, you know, so he's sort of basically saying, like, you know, as your question makes me think, is that my job is to express to think about what I want to think about,
right? Yeah.
You know, and that's sort of the thing. And among those things is sometimes, you know, the you know, profound violence that we are in the midst of, and among those things is the much more tenderness we are in the midst of.
Were you gonna say something else? You had a moment where you like looked like you were gonna say
yeah.
I think all the time about how that's been kind of a gateway for me and a permission for me. You know, I thought about your last poetry book when pursuing the one I worked on, and kind of the one I'm working on now, or like just finished or whatever, and about how it didn't seem to serve me to write only in the mode of resistance, or whatever that looks like, right? As there are as many ways to resist as there are people allegedly resisting.
Exactly.
And I wanted to ask a basketball question. I feel bad because maybe no one cares about us talking about basketball. But
admire our exuberance.
Also, I appreciate how you physically opened it. You like physically turned it.
I know.
So finally,
Go on.
the conversation has begun. I was talking. I recently did an interview with the poet Terrence Hayes, who spent an absurd amount of time at the end of our interview talking about the unattractive basketball player, and how, you know, there are basketball players who are not poetic. You know, he's talking about like
Paul Pierce.
Yeah, right. That's one.
Paul Pierce?
Yeah, you said one of them was Paul Pierce. So you're talking about Ben Simmons, and then he led into Paul Pierce. It's like, you know, Ben Simmons Ben Simmons does so much beautiful, but his game is very ugly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so many times we hear like sports talked about. I feel like a person was like, I'm leaving. I don't want to hear this. So many times we hear sports talked about as poetic, or the movements of sports as poetic. And as people who played sports, shout out to Capital University right across the street where I played soccer and hated it. What is an NBA player who you watch and find poetry in? Like, who's an NBA player you watch and perhaps are not inspired to write, but at least admire and say, wow, there are poetic movements happening.
Yeah.
Because I think so much of your writing is concerned with the very basic functions of the body.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just the very, the movements of basketball. I'm fascinated by this and how it translates to what you're watching and taking in sports-wise.
Yeah. It's funny, like, the people who we think of as, like, the beautiful players are most often not the ones who I'm, like, really interested in. Like, what's the kid's name? Marcus Smart?
Marcus Smart, yeah.
I'm so interested in this kid as a basketball player. Like,
it's his birthday today.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Look at that.
One of my best friends is a rabid Celtics fan.
Oh, really?
So that's the only reason I know this. Yeah. And I was in Boston last night, and they get very intense about him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do they love him?
They do. He has that, like, gritty, blue-collary
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I love his game. And because the people I love are like what we call trash men, like people who do all the other stuff. And because I was never like a really good basketball player, but I could like run, I could rebound, I could fight, and I could like do all this stuff. And I'm in a nice one-on-one game with a kid in my my graduate program. He's like a very good basketball player, and he played in college, and he can shoot, and he's bigger than me, and everything. The whole thing. It's like, and he's 20 years younger than me. But we have these rules, and like, so a rule, I was a coach for a lot of years, and this kid's a serious basketball player. So we put rules on the games as a way to sort of make them more fun, competitive. I don't know, like if someone needs to work on something, we'll add a little thing. You get 2 points for this thing. I think my student and friend Noah needs to work on offensive rebounding, so 2 points for an offensive rebound. Or no, you get a point for an offensive rebound, which he shames me to no end about winning games off of offensive rebounds. Yeah. This may have gotten more esoteric than you're interested. But anyway, so it's the players who I adore are the ones who sort of Rodman was such an interesting player to me.
Yeah, he was
such an amazing player.
Well, not only did he rebound, but I think there was something poetic about the way he rebounded. I used to have this poster, the poster of him grabbing a rebound with his limbs spread really far out.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah, there's a lot.
Can I figured we'd open up for a few audience questions, but can I ask a very somewhat basic or generic question about friendship?
Yeah.
You in Chicago talk with Eve.
Yeah.
And early on in Eve and I's kind of like creative and collaborative friendship, we looked to you and Amy, for example, as an example of because both of us so loved your chapbook.
Yeah.
And Amy recently, by recently I mean maybe like months, to me recently could be recently could have been 2 years ago, so bear with me. But she shared this picture of you riding a bike, or this video of you attempting to ride a bike perhaps in Mississippi, in
like a double bike.
Yeah. And she was like so delighted by it. I think perhaps she shared this like short video, and you could like hear her laughter. And I thought that was just such like an exciting and pure moment of friendship, and I perhaps in front of all these people is not the place to tell you, but that friendship has been a real model for particularly Eve and I as two writers who live far away from each other and still have a desire to maintain a closeness. But since you mentioned friendships and the creative process, what do you think the value is in kind of reciprocating that particular type of affection, both in the work and in the places it doesn't show up outside of the work?
I mean, in the most basic way, it's friendship, and like friendship's friendship, and it's kind of like the reason for being alive. You know what I mean? And the books and the chapbooks and the collaborations are like this other thing, but the friendship is the thing. And there's also like another thing to keep going back to your book, like when you talk about you talk about a little bit about these collaborations, and you talk about the Native Tongues, which is this group of artists in the late 80s, early 90s, who kind of made a kind of collective, and it gets disrupted. And I never thought about this, but it gets disrupted when like money stuff starts to get in the way in a certain kind of way. And I've been admiring the way that some of the you and Eve say, and like some of the other folks who are like very consciously putting together, like what strikes me is like the same thing, like when I think of me and Amy or me and Pat and Ada, or like these little teams, you know, which are not at all like they're not like teams against or anything. It's just like friends. It's like we work together, and we unabashedly work together and love each other's work, and we love each other, and I say for myself, I can't make my work without my friends. Right. I can't do it. Like, I mean, like if I went through the catalog book and was like, how many times Pat said, "Oh, maybe you should do that," and I was like, "Great idea." Yeah. You know? Yeah. Or like some of the solutions in a couple of the essays in here, they were like, I needed people to show me what I was thinking.
Also, your friends are so present in your work, right? Like actually, like by name and by memory and by you know, there's a whole thing that starts out with like my friend Jericho and expands on it. I was gonna ask a question about that, but it's a downer, and I don't want to end on it. I'm gonna end on it. I'm sorry. And then like a few, probably some stuff from the audience. Okay. But I think you know, something that dawned on me recently, perhaps while consuming these books back to back, was that, so I love the thing in Delights about Donny Hathaway. Yeah. And about how Donny Hathaway knew he was going to die and all that. And it seems like so much of your interest in stretching out the singular moment seems, at least to me, to be because you have a stark understanding of brevity and how brief our experience here is. Yeah. That, to me, feels like you know, almost counter to the current cycle of living, right? Where, you know, I think I particularly am prone to waste moments assuming that I will arrive at another one worth celebrating, right? How do you keep a healthy relationship with brevity, but also with the world?
Yeah, good question.
Sorry that it's like not a... I was like, we're going to end our friendship. And then I was like, wait a minute.
No. That's exactly what it is. So like, if we like go through the world knowing that you're going to die and I'm going to die. Yeah. You know? If we really relate to each other like that, I think automatically a kind of tenderness is possible. That is not like in a kind of, you know, in a kind of consumptive, I can just replace it with something else, you know. But if our time here is limited, you know, and in fact, like, to be real, we may never see each other again after this night. Yeah. In a real way. This gathering will never happen again. You know, it's sacred. So the idea of, you know, the fact that this is all fleeting is not. That's sort of what makes it potentially luminous. Yeah. You know what I mean?
I've been thinking a lot. You know, I feel like when musicians die, I often get hit up and people are like, will you write this thing? It's because I like formulated a reputation for turning around the elegy very quickly, right? But I think that's wholly because perhaps to like truly love someone, in this case musician, is to have already imagined the world without the minute. You know what I mean? I think that's like very vital too. Does anyone want to ask anything that's not about death? It can be. It can be. But, all my questions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I guess I was wondering what made you gravitate towards the word delight to describe, I guess, like the moments or experiences that you were writing about.
You know, it really popped into my head. Yeah, that's like what happened. And I never looked it up until like my friend on the last, I wrote it for my birthday, and my friend wrote me like about the etymology of the word and this and that, and I'm like an etymology guy. Like I look words up like that. And it occurred to me after I'd done this for a year, like I was like, wait, what does this word mean? You know? So anyway, but it was like it popped into my head.
I love that. Thank you.
So we talked a little bit about like the writing process.
Yeah.
And we also talked about like the immediacy, like captured in a daily essay. So to kind of like at the end of the writing process, the edits and revisions, like what was your process, and is the immediacy lost a little bit by going back and combing through and editing and all that stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I wrote them all by hand, and when I would transcribe them, the first say 10 or 15 that I was transcribing, I just sort of like naturally was tidying them up as I was transcribing them into the computer. And I realized quickly, like, oh, you're ruining them. Yeah. I didn't yet know how I needed to revise them. So I just did a pretty good job of like just transcribing them. You know, if I misspelled words, that was okay. And then as they built up and I started to feel like, oh, this is what's happening in this book, I was able to sort of go back, and as I read them out loud and could kind of hear how they were being heard, I could start to sort of work on them a little bit. But the question is like, how do you make the dailiness of these things remain and the rapidity of thought remain while making it an okay thing to read, you know? Yeah, totally. Because to like do like how thinking really is, like that's not probably going to be that great to read, you know? So that was sort of what it was. And it was sort of like, and then when I had all of them written out, and then when I had like the final 140, you know, that I was going to sort of work on, and then I could start to like really be like doing some more. And then when I got down to the final 102, and then I could go in further. And I have a very good editor. She was really great in going back and forth and sort of seeing my repetition and seeing my redundancies and being like, you know, you're always talking about this, you know, like maybe cut that one out. Stuff like that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Can you talk about your connection to the natural world? It's one of the things that I love about your poems, and I love about some of the things that you do.
Yeah, tell me, like, just say a little bit more.
Gardens,
plants. Yeah. They're like central, you know, the garden is central to my life. It's central to my sort of imaginative process, even when I'm away from it, like I'm thinking about gardens and other gardens. And I will say too, like a book that I wrote, a thing that I wrote about a bit in that catalog book is, well, no, let me come back. Like, there are talking about like brevity and being in a garden and studying a garden and working on a garden and learning from a garden has sort of more than a lot of things helped me to sort of think hard about things coming and going, things dying and the things coming from the death and all of that kind of exchange.
It's very direct.
Yeah, it's so direct. It's so plain. It's like, you know, but also working on this community orchard that I've worked on for a while, and that this woman, Amy Countryman, dreamt up, and we all kind of followed her and did it. It was this project that of working on something in common that none of us quite knew what it was going to be. None of us knew if we would be around to sort of see. So there's a community orchard in Bloomington. It's a public park basically, but you know, just a bunch of people got together. Bless you. A bunch of people just got together and were like, we want a community orchard, and we sort of figured it out and put it together. And hundreds of people worked on this. But the working on that together with people I did not know until we started working on this thing was this kind of study that felt new to me and kind of wonderful to me. I realize I've done it in other places, being on teams, you know, being in, you know, other kinds of stuff. But it was a magical thing to plant trees with people I did not know, for people I did not know, you know.
And to watch them.
And to watch them turn into some. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the closest thing I know to making a poem.
Yeah, it is like making a poem. Yeah.
Hey, what's up?
Hey.
I'm Alex.
Hey.
I'm gonna read off my phone because I would stutter if I don't. How do you keep a upbeat and like positive vibe with the theme of your work? I'm like kind of an upbeat guy, but all my work is like super depressing and angsty, and I don't know how to. Like, you seem like a really chill guy and like upbeat, and you have like a super upbeat work. I always wonder how you reflect that on a page.
You say your question is how to what's your question again?
Like, how do you keep your work real to yourself, almost?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, my work is sorrowful too. You know, it's like celebration and sorrowful and elegiac and ode, and so in a way, I have my concerns, and I sort of think about my concerns. I think if you know, yeah, I don't know how to answer that question really. Like I know what you're saying. The sort of like sometimes it's hard. Like, is it fun to write angsty stuff?
It's not bad.
But like when you're saying that, are you saying I wish I could do this other thing, or are you like that's just what I do?
I just, you know, I just put stuff on the page and it's angsty and, you know, and it's pretty sad sometimes. And
Yeah.
It's like, that's not how I usually project myself and present myself.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you have things to think about, and your poems are. I meant to say that your poems are places where you think, and so you're thinking through things, and it's possible that the things that you're thinking about in your poems, you have questions about in a way that things that are like sort of happy or something, maybe you don't have questions about in the same way. You know, I myself am just as puzzled and curious about things that delight me as I am in things that make me, you know, sad. So I think that's maybe the question. I think it's an interesting question to ask, because I think often artists are told, people are told that your joy is not the worthy subject of your most rigorous inquiry, which is not true. It is worthy of your most serious and rigorous inquiry. Whether or not you want to do that, that's another thing. You know, do what you want to do. You know, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So you were talking a lot about practice. How has continuing to practice meditation on delight changed how you view the world? Because I can't imagine doing it for a year doesn't change you in some way.
Oh yeah. Well, it definitely reminds you or affirms the fact, which is that the field of our existence is complex. You know, it is not just like, you know, it is not like just getting bashed in the head by the terrible shit. You know, the field of our my existence is complex, and that's vital. That's a vital reminder that what we you know, there's some utility, I feel like, to there's maybe I'll see if I can say it in a positive way. No, I'll say it in a negative way and then sort of see. There is some utility to affirming our alienation from one another. You know, you can sell shit like that. You know, you can, you know, the opposite, which is that we are deeply connected. We are, and we have to study that, and we have to work on that, and that's not always, but that, you know, we're sort of constantly in the midst of caring and stuff like that. It disrupts the foundations of capitalism, of competition, of consumption. You know, if the feeling is I don't need my own shit because I can share. That's such a problem, you know? That's such a problem. Which is all to say, you know, that's a way of me saying the field of our existence affirms that for me, in fact, that is part of our, that is sort of the truth of our lives, you know. And it's you know, you can look around and you see it's happening. It doesn't make great news unless it does, you know. Yeah.
You said earlier that sometimes the world looks to the black artists to offer insight on what's supposed to happen next or what we're supposed to do next. And I was just wondering how you as a poet deal with that pressure.
Wait, which one of us? Me or Ross? Both of us?
Yeah, both.
You go first.
How do I deal with that pressure?
Yeah.
Well, I don't see it as, I don't, because it's not my pressure to deal with, you know. I think that I come from a people who come from a people who come from a people who have sung the songs of urgency for a long time, and my most urgent thing is to rewrite what those songs look like and push them through my own lens, right? And so, I mean, the things I'm most fascinated with, and don't get me wrong, I mean, my first book of poems was written in the midst of like Ferguson and all, so it reflects that time. But then I hit a point, which I'm still, you know, I'm proud of it. I wrote the best book I could at the time. But the minute I finished, my toolbox became something entirely different, right? And I want to reflect the time that is perhaps more invested in building a world better than this one for myself, for the people I care about, for and not for the answering of America's anxieties. I think it's my job to question America, not answer. Particularly.
That's pretty great. That's pretty great. Yeah. Your hand was up, yeah.
Ross, tell us about your T-shirt and why you chose to wear it tonight.
Well, I had another shirt that was kind of a bright color, and I wore it last night, and
But it says Cleveland, right?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, talk about that a little bit.
Well,
is that a basketball thing, or
no, it's a friend of mine whose dad died and is a Cleveland guy and passed it along to me.
Oh.
Yeah.
It looked vintage.
Does it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
You were born in Ohio, yeah?
Youngstown, yeah.
Youngstown, right?
Born in Youngstown.
One of a thing that I boast about often is that Ohio has been a ground for, you know, like Rita Dove and Van Jordan went to the same high school.
Oh, they went to
different
the same high
times,
school?
of course.
Whoa,
But
Whoa,
same
I
high
didn't know
school.
that.
Yeah, Akron is like a good
In
corner for
Akron.
poets.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
yeah, Devo's
Devo.
from Akron.
Oh.
The Black Keys, Chrissy Hind.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean it's yeah.
Oh, it goes on and on.
The list really goes on.
Yeah.
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 So you're in good company.
Yeah.
Maybe one more thing. I don't know. It's up to you.
Yeah,
I don't know how
what do
people
you-
go.
Yeah, you both were talking about like it sounded like the importance of doing nothing a little bit earlier. Like you were
Yeah.
saying,
Shout out to doing nothing. For
Yeah.
real.
you were saying it sounded like you, with intent, try not to write every day, and I kind of got a sense of that from your reading too. You found a haiku in a fireplace outdoors. Do you actually challenge with that in any way? Because it seems like you're at a real like meditative state, like it's almost easy for you. Whereas for me, I know there's value in not doing anything, but if I'm not doing anything, I'm anxious. I have to be working on something.
Yeah.
Do you ever challenge with that yourself?
Like being productive.
Is that something you battle with? The feeling of being productive?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah. What's that?
Do you meditate?
Yeah.
Do you find that's
Like many meditations, you know, and like when I exercise, it's a meditation. When I lift things that are a little like right on the edge of how heavy I can pick them up, that's like it's a meditation, you know. I'm thinking very hard, you know. Gardening is a space of meditation, but I hear and acknowledge that that feeling and that pressure, and you know, also, you know, acknowledge the difference between. I don't know if you have 4 books of you know, but it might be a different thing to have a certain have written some books and be like, okay, it's there. If you have an
audience a little bit, like do you feel like you have to like constantly fight for the audience, like
You know, I'm a little bit not. I don't feel too much like that. I don't.
Well, can I ask a thing?
Yeah.
I think. Well, a thing that I have done is I redefine my nothing, right? Where it's the thing where it's like I don't think I'm doing like one might say to go to the movies alone in the middle of a weekday is to do nothing, but I'm not doing nothing, right? I'm like so I saw Into the Spider-Verse 4 times, right? And even on the 4th time, I did not imagine I was doing something frivolous. I imagined that I was returning to a world that I love so much that it from that world sprung forth something that made my return to the quote unquote something easier, right? So I don't know, like redefine your nothing, maybe.
Kind of like a perspective thing.
Yeah. You're not. I don't think anyone is ever doing nothing. I think we imagine that because of like the capitalist nature of whatever, but you're not doing unless you're. I don't know. Like even like showering for an hour is not doing nothing.
Totally.
Except like wasting water, maybe don't shower for an hour. You know. Especially if you live in California, fam.
Yeah, don't do that. Yeah. I agree. I think that's a great way to think of it. And like poets have been saying that like laying on the grass is work. Like percolating. Like just and besides that, it's just like. It's just good. It feels nice. It feels nice not to do jack shit. That feels good.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a joy.
Thank you.